Hi, Goshen County readers. Okay, so we're going to do this fun thing this summer called Lunch and Listen, where we are going to read through this book here, The Land of Stories, The Wishing Spell. So we're calling it Lunch and Listen because that's when it's going to go live, is at noon, but you could listen to it at any time. I'm sitting here reading it on an afternoon after I've gotten home from work and changed into comfy clothes. So I would suggest you get comfy. You might listen while you eat, or you might color, or you might play with Legos, or there's lots of fun things you can do while you're listening to a story. So when I start a story, there's some things I like to do. First, I like to look at the cover and see what I notice. So this is called The Wishing Spell, and do you notice what's happening? I wonder if you can guess how many characters are maybe in this book. It looks like there might be 2. And they're falling. And I see a wolf here, and a frog, and a fairy. Oh, and a glass slipper. That might be a clue. Oh, I also... Can you see that? You should put in the comments if you can tell me who you think that looks like. And I wonder who that looks like. Also, I like to look at a book and see what I can see about it. So I often will read this because it tells me what it's about and I know what to expect. And I also like to look and see who wrote it. So this is the author, Chris Colfer, and your parents out there might recognize him because he was in Glee. Interesting facts, right? And then here's the other thing. This is kind of cool. Here's a map of all the places they're going to go in the book. So do you see there's the Sleeping Kingdom and the Northern Kingdom, the Charming Kingdom, the Red Riding Hood Kingdom, lots of clues in here, Mermaid Bay, the Troll and Goblin Territory, the Fairy Kingdom, a Hidden Place, the Elf Empire, the Dwarf Forest, and the Corner Kingdom. And then we don't want to ignore anything at the beginning. So right here is a quote. Someday, you will be old enough to start reading fairy tales again. C.S. Lewis. Put in the comments if you know what book C.S. Lewis wrote. Prologue, The Queen's Visit. The dungeon was a miserable place. Light was scarce and flickered from the torches bolted to the stone walls. Foul-smelling water dripped inside from the moat circling the palace above. Large rats chased each other across the floor searching for food. And this was no place for a queen. It was just past midnight, and all was quiet except for the occasional rustle of a chain. Through the heavy silence, a single set of footsteps echoed throughout the halls as someone climbed down the spiral steps into the dungeon. A young woman emerged down the steps, dressed head to toe in a long emerald cloak. She cautiously made her way past the row of cells, sparking the interest of the prisoners inside. With every step she took, her pace became slower and slower, and her heart beat faster and faster. The prisoners were arranged according to crime. The deeper she walked into the dungeon, the crueler and more dangerous the criminals became. Her sights were set on the cell at the very end of the hall, where a prisoner of special interest was being watched by a large private guard. The woman had come to ask a question. It was a simple question, but it consumed her thoughts every day, kept her lying awake most nights, and was the only thing she dreamed about with the little sleep she managed. Only one person could give her the answer she needed, and that person was on the other side of the prison bars ahead. "I wish to see her," the cloaked woman said to the guard. "No one is allowed to see her," the guard said, almost amused by the request. "I am on strict orders from the royal family." The woman lowered her hood and revealed her face. Her skin was as pale as snow. Her hair was as dark as coal, and her eyes were as green as a forest. Her beauty was known throughout the land, and her story was known even beyond that. "Your Majesty, please forgive me," the stunned guard apologized. He quickly bent into an overly pronounced bow. I wasn't expecting anyone from the palace." "No apology necessary," she said. "But please do not speak of my presence here tonight." "Of course," the guard said, nodding. The woman faced the bars, waiting for them to be raised, but the guard hesitated. "Are you sure you want to go in there, Your Highness?" the guard said. "There's no telling what she's capable of." "I must see her," the woman said, "at any cost." The guard began turning a large circular lever, and the bars of the cell rose. The woman took a deep breath and continued past them. She journeyed through a longer, darker hallway where a series of bars and barriers were raised and then lowered after she walked past them. Finally, she reached the end of the hall. The last set of bars was raised, and she stepped inside the cell. The prisoner was a woman. She sat on a stool in the center of a cell and stared at a small window. The prisoner waited a few moments before acknowledging the visitor behind her. It was the first visitor she had ever had, and she knew who it was without looking. There was only one person it could be. "Hello, Snow White," the prisoner said softly. "Hello, stepmother," Snow White replied with a nervous quiver. "I hope you are well." Although Snow White had rehearsed exactly what she wanted to say, she was now finding it nearly impossible to speak. "I heard that you are the queen now," her stepmother said. "It's true," said Snow White. "I've inherited the throne as my father intended. So to what do I owe this honor?" "Have you come to watch me wither away?" her stepmother said. There was such authority and power to her voice. It was known to make the strongest of men melt like ice. On the contrary," Snow White said, "I've come to understand." "To understand what?" her stepmother asked harshly. "Why," Snow White hesitated, "why you did what you did." And with this finally said, Snow White felt a weight lift off her shoulders. She had finally asked the question that had been so strongly on her mind. Half of the challenge was over. "There are many things about this world that you don't understand," the stepmother said, and turned to look at her stepdaughter. It was the first time in a long time that Snow White had seen her stepmother's face. It was the face of a woman who had once possessed beauty without flaw, and the face of a woman who had once been queen. Now the woman sitting before her was just a prisoner whose looks had faded into a permanent, sorrowful scowl. "And that may be," Snow White said, "but can you blame me for trying to find out some sort of reason behind your actions?" The recent years of Snow White's life had become the most scandalous of the kingdom's royal history. Everyone knew the story of the fair princess who had taken refuge with the 7 dwarfs while hiding from her jealous stepmother. Everyone knew of the infamous poisoned apple and the dashing prince who saved Snow White from a false death. The story was simple, but the aftermath was not. Even with a new marriage and a monarchy to occupy her time, Snow White found herself constantly wondering if the theories of her stepmother's vanity were true. Something inside the new queen refused to believe that someone could be so malicious. "Do you know what they're calling you out there?" Snow White asked. "Outside these prison walls, the world refers to you as the evil queen. If that is what the world has labeled me, then that is the name I shall learn to live with," the queen said. "Once the world has made a decision, there is little anyone can do to change its mind." Snow White was astonished by how little her stepmother cared, but Snow White needed her to care. She needed to know there was some humanity left in her. "They wanted to execute you after they discovered your crimes against me. The whole kingdom wanted you dead." Snow White's voice faded to a faint whisper as she fought off the emotions building up inside her. "But I wouldn't allow it. I couldn't." "Am I supposed to thank you for sparing me?" the evil queen asked. "If you expect someone to fall at your feet and express gratitude, you've come to the wrong cell." "I didn't do it for you. I did it for myself," Snow White said. "Like it or not, you are the only mother I have ever known. I refuse to believe that you are the soulless monster the rest of the world claims you to be. Whether it's true or not, I believe there's a heart deep down inside of you." Tears rolled down Snow White's pale face. She had promised herself she would stay strong, but she had lost control of her emotions once she was in her stepmother's presence. "Then I'm afraid you're wrong," the evil queen said. "The only soul I've ever had died a long time ago, and the only heart you'll find in my possession is a heart of stone." The evil queen did indeed have a heart of stone, but not inside her. A rock in the shape and size of a human heart was on a small table in the corner of the cell. It was the only item the evil queen had been permitted to keep when she was arrested. Snow White recognized the stone from her childhood. It had always been very precious to her stepmother, and the evil queen had never let it out of her sight. Snow White had never been allowed to touch it or hold it, but nothing was stopping her now. She walked across the cell, picked it up, and curiously stared down at it. It brought back so many memories. All the neglect and sadness her stepmother had caused her as a child rushed through her. All my life, I only wanted one thing, Snow White said. Your love. When I was a girl, I used to spend hours hiding in the palace, just hoping you would notice I was missing. But you never did. You spent your days in your chambers with your mirrors and your skin creams and the stone. You spent more time with strangers with anti-aging methods than you did with your own daughter. But why? The evil queen did not answer. You tried to kill me 4 times, 3 of which you attempted yourself, Snow White said, shaking her head in disbelief. When you dressed as an old woman and came to me at the dwarf's cottage, I knew it was you. I knew you were dangerous, but I kept letting you in. I kept hoping that you would change. I let you harm me. Snow White had never confessed this to anyone, and she couldn't help but bury her face in the palms of her hands and cry after saying it. You think you know heartbreak? The evil queen said so sharply that it startled her stepdaughter. You know nothing of pain. You never received affection from me, but from the moment you were born, you were loved by the whole kingdom. Others, however, are not so fortunate. Others, Snow White, sometimes have the only loves they've ever known taken from them. Snow White didn't know what to say. What love was she referring to? Are you speaking of my father? Snow White asked. The evil queen closed her eyes and shook her head. Naivete is such a privileged trait, she said. Believe it or not, Snow White, I had my own life before I came into yours. Snow White grew quiet and slightly ashamed. Of course she knew her stepmother had had a life prior to marrying her father, but she had never considered what it had consisted of. Her stepmother had always been such a private person. Snow White never had reason to. Where's my mirror? The evil queen demanded. It's to be destroyed, Snow White told her. Suddenly, the evil queen's stone became much heavier in Snow White's hand. Snow White didn't know if this was really happening or if she was just imagining it. Her arm became tired from holding the stone heart, and she had to put it aside. There's so much you're not telling me, Snow White said. There are so many things you've kept from me all these years. The evil queen lowered her head and stared at the ground. She remained silent. I may be the only person in the world with any compassion for you. Please tell me it isn't going to waste, Snow White pleaded. If there were events in your past that influenced your recent decisions, please explain them to me. Still, there was no response. I'm not leaving here until you do, Snow White yelled, raising her voice for the first time in her life. Fine, the evil queen said. Snow White took a seat on another stool in the cell. The evil queen waited a moment before beginning, and Snow White's anticipation grew. Your story will forever be romanticized, she told Snow White. No one will ever think twice about mine. I will continue to be degraded into nothing but a grotesque villain until the end of time. But what the world fails to realize is that a villain is just a victim whose story hasn't been told. Everything I've done, my life's work, and my crimes against you has all been for him. Snow White felt her own heart grow heavy. Her head was spinning and curiosity had taken over her entire body. Who? She asked so quickly that she forgot to hold back the desperation in her voice. The evil queen closed her eyes and let her memories surface. Images of places and people from her past flew out from the back of her mind like fireflies in a cave. There was so much she had seen in her younger years, so many things she wished she remembered, and so many things she wished to forget. I will tell you about my past, or at least the past of someone I once was, the evil queen said, but consider yourself warned. My story is not one that ends with a happily ever after. Chapter 1. Once Upon a Time. Once upon a time, Mrs. Peters said to her 6th grade class, these are the most magical words our world has ever known and the gateway into the greatest stories ever told. They're an immediate calling to anyone who hears them, a calling into a world where everyone is welcome and anything can happen. Mice can become men, maids can become princesses, and they can teach valuable lessons in the process. Alex Bailey eagerly sat up in her seat. She usually enjoyed her teacher's lessons, but this was something especially close to her heart. Fairy tales are much more than silly bedtime stories, the teacher continued. The solution to almost every problem imaginable can be found in the outcome of a fairy tale. Fairy tales are life lessons disguised with colorful characters and situations. The Boy Who Cried Wolf teaches us the value of a good reputation and the power of honesty. Cinderella shows us the rewards of having a good heart. The Ugly Duckling teaches us the meaning of inner beauty. Alex's eyes were wide, and she nodded in agreement. She was a pretty girl with bright blue eyes and short strawberry blonde hair that was always kept neatly out of her face with a headband. The way the other teachers stared at their teacher, as if the lesson being taught were in another language, was something Mrs. Peters had never grown accustomed to. So, Mrs. Peters would often direct entire lessons to the front row where Alex sat. Mrs. Peters was a tall, thin woman who always wore dresses that resembled old, patterned sofas. Her hair was dark and curly and sat perfectly on the top of her head like a hat, and her students often thought it was. Through a pair of thick glasses, her eyes were permanently squinted from all the judgmental looks she had given her classes over the years. Sadly, these timeless tales are no longer relevant in our society, Mrs. Peters said. We have traded their brilliant teachings for small-minded entertainment like television and video games. Parents now let obnoxious cartoons and violent movies influence their children. The only exposure to tales some children acquire are versions bastardized by film companies. Fairy tale adaptations are usually stripped of every moral and lesson the stories were originally intended to teach, and replaced with singing and dancing forest animals. I recently read that films are being created depicting Cinderella as a struggling hip-hop singer and Sleeping Beauty as a warrior princess battling zombies. Awesome, a student behind Alex whispered to himself. Alex shook her head. Hearing this made her soul hurt. She tried to share her disapproval with her fellow classmates, but, sadly, her concern was not reciprocated. I wonder if the world would be a different place if everyone knew these tales in the way the Brothers Grimm and Hans Christian Andersen intended them to be known. Mrs. Peters said, I wonder if people would learn from the Little Mermaid's heartbreak when she dies at the end of a real story. I wonder if there would be so many kidnappings if children were shown the true dangers that Little Red Riding Hood faced. I wonder if delinquents would be so inclined to misbehave if they knew about the consequences Goldilocks caused for herself with the 3 little bears. There is so much to learn and prevent for our futures if we just open our eyes to past teachings. Perhaps if we embraced fairy tales as much as we could, it would be much easier to find our own happily ever afters. If Alex had her way, Mrs. Peters would be rewarded with thunderous applause after each lesson she gave. Unfortunately, all that followed her classes was a mutual sigh of relief among the students, thankful that they were over. Let's see how well you all know your fairy tales, the teacher said with a smile, and began pacing the room. In Rumpelstiltskin, what did the young maiden's father tell the king that his daughter could spin hay into? Does anyone know? Mrs. Peters scanned the classroom, like a shark looking for wounded fish. Only one student raised her hand. Yes, Miss Bailey, Mrs. Peters called. He claimed he could spin it into gold, Alex said. Very good, Miss Bailey, Mrs. Peters said. If she had a favorite student, not that she would ever admit to having one, Alex would have been it. Alex was eager to please. She was the definition of a bookworm. It didn't matter what time of day it was, before school, during school, after school, before bed. She was always reading. She had a thirst for knowledge, and because of it, Alex was usually the first person to answer Mrs. Peters' questions. She tried her best to impress her classmates with every chance she got, putting extra effort into each book report and class presentation she was assigned. However, this usually annoyed the other students, and Alex was often teased for it. She constantly heard other girls making fun of her behind her back. She usually spent lunch alone under a tree somewhere with an open library book. Although she could never tell anyone, Alex was so lonely that sometimes it hurt. Now, can anyone tell me what the compromise was that the maiden made with Rumpelstiltskin? Alex waited a moment before putting her hand up. She didn't want to seem like a total teacher's pet. Yes, Miss Bailey. In exchange for turning the hay into gold, the maiden promised to give Rumpelstiltskin her firstborn child when she became queen, Alex explained. That's a pretty steep deal, said a boy behind Alex. What's a creepy old short man want with a baby anyway? A girl next to him asked. Obviously, he couldn't adopt with a name like Rumpelstiltskin, another student added. Did he eat the baby? Someone else asked nervously. Alex turned around to face her clueless peers. You're all missing the point of the story, Alex said. Rumpelstiltskin took advantage of the maiden because she was in need. The story is about the price of a bad negotiation. What are we willing to give up long-term in the future for something short-term in the present? Get it? If Mrs. Peters could change her facial expression, she would have looked very proud. Nicely put, Miss Bailey, she said. I must say, in all my years of teaching, I rarely come across a pupil with as much in-depth knowledge as... A loud snore suddenly came from the back of the classroom. A boy in the back row was slouched over his desk and drooling from the corner of his mouth, very much asleep. Alex had a twin brother, and it was moments like these that made her wish she didn't. Mrs. Peters diverted her attention to him like a paper clip to a magnet. Mr. Bailey? Mrs. Peters asked. He continued to snore. Mr. Bailey? Mrs. Peters asked again, kneeling down closer to him. He let out another enormous snore. A few of the students wondered how it was possible for such a loud noise to come out of him. Mr. Bailey! Mrs. Peters shouted in his ear. As if someone had lit a firework under a seat, Connor Bailey jumped back to life, almost knocking his desk over. Where am I? What happened? Connor asked in a panicked state of confusion. His eyes darted around the room, while his brain tried to remember where he was. Like his sister, he also had bright blue eyes and strawberry blonde hair. His face was round and freckled, and at the moment slightly smushed to one side like a basset hound when it first wakes up from a nap. Alex couldn't have been more embarrassed by her brother. Besides sharing looks and birthday, she and her brother couldn't have been more different. Connor may have a lot of friends, but unlike his sister, he had trouble in school, mostly trouble staying awake. I'm so glad you could rejoin us, Mr. Bailey, Mrs. Peters said sternly. Did you have a nice nap? Connor turned bright red. I'm so sorry, Mrs. Peters, he apologized, trying to be as genuine as possible. Sometimes when you talk for long periods of time, I doze off. No offense. I can't help it. You fall asleep in my class at least twice a week, Mrs. Peters reminded him. Well, you do talk a lot. Before he could stop himself from saying it, Connor knew it was the wrong thing to say. A few of the students had to bite their hands to stop from laughing. I recommend you stay awake while I teach, Mr. Bailey, Mrs. Peters threatened. Connor had never seen anyone squint their eyes so tight without shutting them before. Unless you know enough about fairy tales to teach this lesson yourself, she added. I probably do, Connor said. Once again, he spoke without thinking. I mean, I know a lot about this stuff, that's all. Oh, really? Mrs. Peters never backed down from a challenge, and every student's worst nightmare was that they'd be her challenge. All right, Mr. Bailey, if you're so knowledgeable, answer this question. Connor gulped. In the original tale of Sleeping Beauty, how many years does the princess sleep before she is awoken by true love's first kiss? Mrs. Peters asked, studying his face. All eyes were on him, impatiently waiting for the slightest indication that he didn't know the answer. But fortunately for Connor, he did. 100, Connor answered. Sleeping Beauty slept for 100 years. That's why the castle grounds were covered in vines and stuff, because the curse affected everyone in the kingdom, and there was no one in the garden. Mrs. Peters didn't know what to say or do. She frowned down at him, immensely surprised. This was the first time he had ever been correct when she'd put him on the spot, and she certainly hadn't expected it. Try to stay conscious, Mr. Bailey. Lucky for you, I used my last attention slip this morning, but I can always request more, Mrs. Peters said, and promptly walked to the front of the classroom to continue her lesson. Connor sighed with relief, and the red drained from his face. His eyes met his sister's. Even she was surprised he had gotten the right answer. Alex hadn't expected Connor to remember any fairy tales. Now, class, I want you all to get out your literature books. Turn to page 170 and read Little Red Riding Hood quietly to yourselves, Mrs. Peters instructed. The students did as they were told. Connor made himself as comfortable as possible at his desk and began reading. The story, the pictures, and the characters were all so familiar to him. I wonder why they're so familiar to him. So I think we learned who these two characters were. Don't forget to tell me what books C.S. Lewis wrote in the comments on Facebook, and I might put you in one of our drawings for our summer reading prizes. So I hope you've gotten your bag for summer reading, and you listened to the Popcorn Dragon that Miss Anita read, and then you're ready to join us as we read through this. Have a great day.